Hey guys, this video is meant to be a review because of the snow day for our first quiz on chapters 1 through 4. So for the next few minutes, I will be going through chapters 1 through 4 and highlighting key terms that you should know for our first quiz. The first quiz will be entirely multiple choice and true and false. I would expect between 20, let's call it 20 to 25 questions. So here we go. We'll start scrolling through the first chapter here. So I would be familiar with this. Wealth management investment process can be organized into four general categories. That's the client relationship, the client profile, the IPS or the wealth management investment policy, and then the portfolio management, monitoring, and market review. So that is something that will surely show up on the first quiz. Next, inside the client profile, you should know that the client profile contains the client goals. You should also know that it contains the risk tolerance and what risk tolerance is. You should also be familiar with the term behavioral biases as well as client constraints. We'll skip life balance sheet for the quiz. We won't need to know that. You should also know that the tax profile would be included in this and be familiar with the term tax profile. Be familiar with the term market expectations. Next, be familiar with the term wealth management investment policy or investment policy statement, and know that it includes a risk and return objective. Know the components of investment constraints. What are the 5 investment constraints? You should certainly know that for the exam as well. Strategic asset allocation, asset class constraints. Typically on my IPSs, we'll see that as something like 60% stocks, 40% bonds. We might also talk about investment constraints, like we don't do options trading and we don't trade on margin. I think that's a given, so we don't restrict it. But if we allowed margin trading, I would list that. Oh, lastly, one more thing here with implementation, monitoring, and review. Be familiar really with this whole page right here, the IPS and categories that are underneath each one. Implementation, monitoring, and review, the components that are consisting there. So one of those things would be rebalancing guidelines. How often do you bring the portfolio back to target? That's the end of chapter 1. Good content there for the first quiz. Chapter 2, fiduciary and professional standards. Be familiar with the term fiduciary duty. Also be familiar with the Model Prudent Investor Act. That's a low likelihood I'll ask that. Be familiar with the term ERISA and what that brought. Be familiar with the heart of the restatement in terms of principles of prudence. The principles in prudence, there are 5 of them. Sound diversification, risk and return are so directly related that trustees have a duty to analyze and make conscious decisions concerning the levels of appropriate risk. Also, trustees have a duty to avoid fees. Fiduciary duty has the duty of impartiality, requires a balancing of elements between production of current income and protection of purchasing power. And then trustees may have the duty as well of having the authority to delegate. So, we want to invest in emerging markets. So I'll hire an emerging markets manager or a mutual fund to do that work for me because maybe I'm not qualified to pick stocks in that market. In regards to professional standards, be familiar with the code of ethics, act with integrity, place integrity above the place the integrity of the investment profession and the interest of the clients above your own. Use reasonable care and judgment. Practice and encourage others to practice in a professional and ethical manner. Promote integrity of capital markets and then maintain and improve the professional competence. Next, the CFA standards of professional conduct. Also be familiar with these: professionalism, integrity of capital markets, duty to employers, duty to clients, investment analysis, recommendations and actions, conflicts of interest, and the responsibilities of the CFA Institute member or candidate. Be familiar with GIPS. It's a reporting standard, so you can accurately compare one manager to another. Sorry for the silence while we scroll through this really quickly. This is a lot of repeating of what we just covered and really diving into those key terms that we have previously seen. And that will be it for chapter 2. That's a good amount of topics on ethics. Chapter 3, goals and constraints. So be familiar with the term goal setting and the term hidden goals. Be familiar with non-investment, intermediate, and long-term goals. Scrolling through here pretty quickly. Be familiar with goal priority. For most people, the number one goal is usually for funding their lifestyle, and then they might have secondary goals like paying for college for their children. Be familiar with risk objective. What is their risk tolerance? I had a conversation with a client today who said he was very risk oriented. He had done really well, but I asked him how would he feel if his portfolio was down 40%? Would he still be willing to stick to the plan? Be familiar with constraints. For each of the goals, the constraints include time horizon, liquidity, and marketability, the tax environment, their ability and willingness to take risk, and then legal and regulatory considerations. And it goes through each of those here if you need more info. And as a reminder, again, this is going to be entirely true and false and multiple choice. Another term right here. So, a good investor tries to balance between income and capital gains. So be familiar with that. Or what total return is another way I could ask that. Okay, now on to the final chapter 4, Risk is a 4-letter word. So be familiar with the term risk tolerance. Risk tolerance versus risk capacity, or oftentimes as ability versus willingness to take risk. Sometimes those can be out of alignment. Um, uh, we'll skip this one. Be familiar with the term heuristics and biases. What are those? One is representativeness. Be familiar with that. Another one is gambler's fallacy. Be familiar with that term. Availability bias. Be familiar with that term. Don't have to know it in the form of the formula, but a mental shortcut is based on using what comes to mind. So you just look at what's in front of you, not anything deeper. There are some examples of the availability bias here. Be familiar with the overconfidence bias. Confirmation bias, looking up information that only agrees with your original sentiment. Effectively, with the confirmation bias, you put blinders on. Confirmation bias, and I might try to switch these up to trick you, but confirmation bias and availability bias can be often mixed up together. So I wouldn't be surprised to see those in the same set of multiple choice answers. Framing bias, be familiar with the framing bias or the prospect theory. Also be familiar with the difference between loss aversion and risk aversion. And that is it for the first quiz. So that's what I would anticipate being on it. I think we have enough good content there for a good 20 to 25 question exam. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions.